Alright, another Netflix original horror miniseries has been released to critical acclaim, The Fall of the House of Usher. Anyone check this show out yet? What did you think? Let us know in the comments. Just like with Mike Flanagan's previous work, The Haunting of Hill House and other stuff he's done, this Poe-inspired gothic horror series is packed with Easter eggs, and because everyone goes nuts for Easter eggs, we're delving into some of them today. I'm your host James, and today I'm bringing you the top 5 scary The Fall of the House of Usher Easter eggs you missed. And we're starting off this list with one of the most famous images associated with Poe, that being the Raven. There are tons of Raven motifs hidden throughout this series. A Raven, an obvious nod to Poe, as the Raven is probably his most well-known poem. First published in 1845, tells the story of a man who is visited by a mysterious raven late at night, and from there he begins a melancholic descent into madness. The narrator mourns the death of his beloved Lenore, and is visited by a talking raven. Throughout the poem, the narrator becomes increasingly desperate, asking the raven a series of questions to which the raven only replies, "Nevermore." You get ravens lurking in the backgrounds of scenes here. You get a physical raven that makes a number of appearances. There's the stuffed raven that sits above the bar in the flashbacks, looming over Roderick as a sign of impending doom. The first episode is also called Midnight Dreary, which is the opening line of the Raven. And this is really cool, but Verna, the main antagonist of the series, is an anagram for Raven. There's also a couple other references to the Raven outside of ravens themselves. Madeline's quote-unquote Lenore bot is an obvious reference to Lenore in the Raven, and the narrator's lost lover, and continuously texts Roderick the word "nevermore." There are also a few other animal motifs that could be possible nods to Poe's work, though. For starters, that black cat clock in young Roderick's home could be a bit of a clever foreshadowing, and of course, we have the whole black cat episode. There's also a horse painting in the bar, which could be a reference to the Metzengerstein, Poe's first published piece. A short story, first published in 1832. The tale revolves around the feud between two noble families, the Metzengersteins and the Berlifitzings. Frederick von Metzgerstein, known for his cruelty, inherits the Metzengerstein estate and is suspected of burning down the Berlifitzing stables, resulting in Wilhelm von Berlifitzing's death. Frederick becomes obsessed with a monstrous orange horse recovered from the fire, displaying eerie resemblances to a depicted horse in a family tapestry. Frederick rides the horse obsessively, leading to concerns about his sanity, and one night, Frederick and the horse charge towards a burning stable consumed by flames. As they perish, witnesses observe the smoke forming the figure of a massive horse. And at number 4, we have a reference to Hush. There aren't just references to Poe's work in this series. Mike Flanagan has quite an impressive resume at this point, and with 9 films under his belt, and this being his 5th series for Netflix, there are some nods to his own work in here as well. Hush is a slasher that he directed in 2016, also starring Kate Siegel, the same year the two got married. The story follows Maddie Young, a deaf and mute author who lives alone in a secluded house in the woods. One night, a masked intruder appears at her window and begins stalking her. Unaware of Maddie's disability, the intruder sees her as an easy target. A deadly game of cat and mouse begins as Maddie must use her wits and resourcefulness to outsmart the baddie and survive the night. The villain wears a very distinctive white ghoulish mask, a mask that we actually see make a short appearance in this new series, a cameo if you will. The second episode is called The Mask of the Red Death, so it's no surprise that we get a masquerade party here. Obviously you have heavy references to the original Mask of the Red Death story. Verna shows up with a red gown and a skull mask, the omen of death that is to come. But is this the only sign of bad things to come? Prospero's partner Jenny wears a mask that looks a lot like the mask worn by the sadistic menace in Hush. Not just similar actually, I wouldn't be surprised if it's the exact same mask. I'll avoid spoilers here, but then pretty soon things go very sideways. The ending of this episode actually reminded me a lot of the opening scene in Blade, which is one of the coolest movie openings of all time. This was less slick martial arts, vampire action, and more horrific mess, but I don't know, just reminded me a bit of that scene. There's also a fun reference to another Mike Flanagan movie here. When Lenore and Morella are watching Netflix, you see them rest on Gerald's Game for a couple seconds. Very meta, seeing as Gerald's Game stars Carla Gugino, who plays Verna in this series, and Bruce Greenwood, who plays Roderick. And Henry Thomas is in it too, who plays Frederick. And if you've seen Gerald's Game, you know that he plays a very disturbing character in that movie. Kate Siegel is also in Gerald's Game, married to Henry Thomas's character. So yeah, very strange that Gerald's Game exists in the universe of this show. I like to imagine that the Ushers got into acting for a short time and starred in Gerald's Game, as gross as that would be. Yeah, you know what? I don't actually like to imagine that actually, but I spent a lot of time having to think about it when I sat down to write this. I was forced to think about it, and now I'm forcing all of you to think about it. So thank me in the comments, I guess. We know that pretty much every character is named after a character from Poe's many stories and poems, but there are also some references to Poe's personal life in this series as well. Bit of a spoiler ahead, but in the Netflix series, Roderick and Madeline Usher's mother, Eliza, dies of a mysterious illness. This mirrors the death of Poe's mother in real life, whose name was also Eliza. Eliza Poe was an English-born actress. She married David Poe Jr., an American actor, and they had 3 children, including, of course, Edgar. She died in 1811 when Edgar was only 2 years old. And the cause of her death still somewhat unclear. Some have suggested it could have been tuberculosis, others mentioned pneumonia. Following Eliza's death, David Poe Jr. struggled with alcoholism and financial instability, eventually abandoning his children, and Edgar was taken in by John Allen, a successful businessman in Richmond, Virginia, but he was never formally adopted. His mother's early death had a huge impact on Poe's life, majorly influencing his work that explores themes of death and loss and loneliness and sadness. It's not just his mother, though, who's referenced here. William Longfellow, Roderick and Madeline's father, is a reference to a real-life poet who Poe accused of plagiarism back in the day. There was a writer and critic who drew a lot of attention to Poe's work. His name was John Neal, which is the name of the judge in this series. And this one is a bit more subtle, but the very large age gap between Roderick and Juno could be a reference to Poe's real-life marriage with Virginia Eliza Clem Poe. Poe was 27 when they got married, and she was 13. Yeah, different times. Finally, Rufus Griswold is also named after a real-life enemy, rival of Poe's. Alright, number 2, beating hearts. Heartbeat sound effects are used a lot in horror movies. It can be a very disconcerting sound. It's an intimate bodily sound that is directly connected to our being alive, and its pace says a lot about our current emotion. It's a sound that can easily build tension. But here in the 5th episode, entitled The Telltale Heart, we get a chirping sound, a sound that gets more and more unsettling as the episode goes on. Yeah, this episode, I think this one creeped me out the most, and Tania Miller's increasingly manic performance, incredible. Anyway, of course, there are heavy references to the original short story going on here. And it also makes sense this is my favorite episode because The Telltale Heart is probably my favorite Poe piece. Such a simple but haunting premise. The narrative is presented by an unnamed protagonist who is fixated on an elderly man's vulture-like eye. Driven by this irrational fear, the narrator decides to rid themselves of this eye forever, and one night they cautiously enter the old man's room and suffocate him, eliminating the source of their dread. At least that's what they think. And then following the act, the narrator hides the dismembered body beneath the floorboards. Despite having done this seemingly perfect crime, though, the narrator becomes overwhelmed by guilt and paranoia, convinced they can hear the old man's heart still beating, growing louder and louder and more unbearable. Tormented by the imagined sound, they eventually confess their deed to the police, believing the heart's relentless rhythm exposes their crime. It's a perfect allegory for crippling guilt and paranoia. Spoiler alert here, might want to skip to number 1 to avoid. But I love the reveal at the end of this episode that the sound isn't just in Victorine's head the whole time, but it's actually the heart device making her partner's, ex-partner's hearts pump, so creepy. And then you hear the sound keep going over the credits. I was watching, I was like, no, stop, I don't want to hear that anymore. Very effective. Anyway, Telltale Heart isn't just referenced in the Telltale Heart episode, I don't think anyway. I almost feel like it's at the center of the entire series. The events we're watching unfold are all acting as Roderick's confession to Dupin. This is similar to the Telltale Heart, with the narrator confessing to the police at the end of the story. And much like in Poe's original tale, Roderick is also being plagued by the ghosts of his past, seemingly having been driven mad, actually seeing them appear in the room to terrorize him. Finally, we have the Easter eggs in Murder in the Rue Morgue. This one is more obvious, but I just think it was really cool how they incorporated the original short story into this series. Basically, in the original story, there's this horrific incident that's happened. A woman and her daughter are found dead in their apartment, bodies brutally mutilated. Local police are perplexed, unable to comprehend the grisly scene. C. August Dupin, a detective, steps in to unravel the mystery. He figures out that an escaped orangutan is actually the perpetrator. So there's already lots of characters, lots of plot going on in this series. How do you throw a violent ape into the mix? Well, here you have Victorine as a gifted surgeon who experiments on chimpanzees. There's also some detective work going on here, just like in the original story, only it's Camille doing the snooping instead of Dupin. And the facility's name is also a clever reference to the Rue Morgue, Roderick Usher Experimental. Tons more we could probably go over here. If you ever wanted a part 2, just let us know in the comments. With all that said though, I've been your host James, and I'll catch you, yes you specifically, in the next video.